Shalom, welcome back. Today we're going to be exploring the question of whether Yeshua was a Jew or whether we've been misled yet again. So, I keep coming back to this quotation. It's been on my mind quite a lot in Matthew 11, where Yeshua he's talking about the people there questioning him, and he's basically saying, what did you expect? What are you wanting to hear? And I think this is Yeshua's way of addressing what I've run into a lot over the years of doing videos like this, which is essentially that people don't want to hear the truth generally. They want to hear their truth coming out of your mouth. And that's really the source of a lot of the, I guess, negative comments that I see from people. They don't want to hear what you think. And again, it's like, well, why are you listening to my channel then? You get a lot of people who will send me emails and such and saying that I should cover this subject or cover that subject. And it's like, dude, you cover it. You make it. If it's something that you believe that much in it, make your own video. Do it yourself. I mean, that's how I started. I just saw a need for some truth to get out there, and I started making videos. And if you look at what I believed early on, and some of the videos I was making years ago, they're very different than what I'm talking about today, because that's obviously, I think, evidence of spiritual growth. If you're going to a church and the pastor's been teaching the same thing for the last 10 or 15 years, then maybe you should start questioning whether you are at the right place. Because any pastor, any one who's presenting information about Yeshua, they should be growing, right? They should be like getting new information, new inspiration from heaven, and God should be leading them to new understandings of things. And it's really difficult to find a lot of truth behind a pulpit. And of course, there's this other issue that I brought up last time, which is for fear of the Edomites. People don't want to speak openly about certain things. So today we're going to be looking at a letter, and the name of the letter is it's an open letter, and the name that it goes by is Facts Are Facts, and it's written by Mr. Benjamin Freedman. And so I looked for some biographical information on Mr. Freedman. This is what I found online. It says that Benjamin H. Freedman was one of the most intriguing and amazing individuals of the 20th century. Born in 1890, he was a successful Jewish businessman in New York City. One-time principal owner of the Woodbury Soap Company. He broke with organized Jewry after the Judeo-Communist victory of 1945. He spent the remainder of his life and the great preponderance of his considerable fortune, at least $2.5 million, exposing the Jewish tyranny which has enveloped the United States. Mr. Freedman knew what he was talking about because he had been an insider at the highest levels of Jewish organizations and Jewish machinations to gain power over the nation. Mr. Freedman was personally acquainted with Bernard Baruch, Samuel Untermeyer, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, and many more movers and shakers of our times. And so, that's a basic biography of Mr. Freedman. He was a Jew that converted to Christianity. And like it says early on, he was, a friend of socialism, but then he became disenchanted with him when he realized that it was really just a satanic plan for tyranny. And so he wrote this letter. And so the writing that we're going to be studying is a facsimile reproduction of a letter addressed to Mr. David Goldstein, written by Mr. Freedman. And this is from the introduction of the letter. It says, "A little patience with the early pages will be rewarded." I'm actually going to use a lot of material from the early pages because I think that there's a lot of information in there that maybe we should consider. Mr. Goldstein, the recipient of the letter, was an American Christian apologist who had converted from Judaism to the Roman Catholic Church and founded the Catholic Campaigners for Christ in the early 1900s. Goldstein was also a former organizer of the Socialist Labor Party of America, later became disenchanted with Marxism, and worked against the spread of socialism in the United States. So these are two Jewish men who had converted to Christianity. And like I said earlier, it's Mr. Freedman writing to Mr. Goldstein. So we're going to go ahead and get right into it. This is from the introduction to the letter. Mr. Freedman saying, "Your very outstanding achievements as a convert to Catholicism impressed me." He goes on. He's kind of spending a little bit of time very graciously and complimentary toward Dr. Goldstein. And is essentially, I think, kind of buttering him up a little bit, as we'll see when he gets down to about the third paragraph. And he says, "In view of the fact that it requires great courage for me to write to you as I am about to do, so I pray when you receive this communication from me, you will keep in mind Galatians 4:16, where the apostate says, 'Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? I hope you'll so favor me.'" So this is kind of setting Mr. Goldstein up, I think, for some disagreement. But I think it's very... I like reading letters like this where you see the way the author is kind of setting the stage and using kindness to kind of get the recipient to open up a little bit to what he's about to say. He says, "Your most recent article coming to my attention appeared in the September issue of the APJ Bulletin, the official publication of the organization calling themselves the Arch Confraternity of Prayer for the Peace and Goodwill to Israel. The headline of the article, 'News and Views of Jews and the Purpose of the Organization,' stated in the masthead of the publication, 'to promote interest in the apostolate to Israel,' prompts me to take farther time by his 4 o'clock and promptly offer my comments. I beg your indulgence accordingly." So it appears that Mr. Goldstein is involved in what we would refer to today as Christian Zionism. I would make, my own opinion is that I don't think you can be a Christian and a Zionist, to be honest with you, but that's essentially the individual that Mr. Freedman is reaching out to. He says, "I must respectfully and sincerely urge you to analyze and to study carefully the data submitted to here. I suggest also that if you then take whatsoever steps you consider appropriate and necessary as a result of your conclusions in the invisible and intangible ideological war being waged in defense of the great Christian heritage against its dedicated enemies, your positive attitude is vital to victory." So he's writing about this war that's being waged, and to be honest with you, I think it's a war that's still being waged, and the majority of Christianity has fallen asleep to it. And I believe that the two parties engaged in this war is in the first paragraph in the blue, the apostolic, which would be the church, and of course Israel, Edom. And so I'm going to take the point that Mr. Freedman is making here, and I'm going to respectfully and sincerely analyze and study carefully the data submitted. And I would invite you to do so too. He goes on to say, "You must assuredly subscribe fully to that sound and sensible sentiment that it is better to light one candle than to sit in darkness. My solitary attempts to date to give light to them that sit in darkness and in the shadow may prove no more successful with you now than they have in so many other instances where I have failed during the past 30 years. In your case, I feel rather optimistic at the moment." So this is an issue that Mr. Freedman has been trying to make public. He says he's been working on it for 30 years. And it's obviously something he's not been able to get a whole lot of traction with. He says, "Although not completely in vain, I still live in the hope that one day one of these candles will burst into flame like a long smoldering spark and start a conflagration that will sweep across the nation like a prairie fire and illuminate vast new horizons for the first time." And I'll pause here to say that this is something that I feel very similarly about. That's the whole reason I make videos, is because I'm trying to, and I'm hoping that at some point the information will ignite a fire, that people will grasp hold of some of the truths that I try to present here. And thus far, not many have. I got a small following, but I do believe that some of the information I talk about could turn the church back to where it needs to be. Particularly, like most recently, what I've been talking about with the identity of Esau, Edom. I think if we as a community embraced that understanding and acted accordingly, that we could get the church back on the rails. Because right now the train has went off the rails and is careening toward a cliff, in my opinion. It has been correctly contended for thousands of years that in the end truth always prevails. We all realize that truth in action can prove itself a dynamic power of unlimited force. But alas, truth has no self-starter. Truth cannot get off dead center unless a worthy apostle gives truth a little push to overcome its inertia. Without that start, truth will stand still and will never arrive at its intended destination. In other words, if no one is speaking the truth, then you can't expect the truth to do anything. But there's this saying that truth is like a lion. All you have to do is let it loose. You don't have to defend it. And to some extent that is true. But you have to let it loose. You have to put it out there, and it has to be given to people who are worthy and willing and courageous enough to carry it on, and so that it doesn't die with the first group of people that hears the truth, right? He says, on the other hand, truth has many times been completely blacked out by repeatedly contradictory and conflicting untruths over and over again and again and again. The world's recent history supplies sober testimony of the dangers to civilization inherent in that technique. That form of treason to truth is treachery to mankind. You must be very careful, my dear viewer. Now, in the original letter, it says you must be very careful, dear Mr. Goldstein. But I said, you must be careful, my dear viewer, not to become unwittingly one of the many accessories before and after the fact who have appeared upon the scene of public affairs in recent years. So in other words, I'm kind of addressing this to you guys, you listeners, that before you start unwittingly defending something that's not true, you have a duty to investigate it. And the subject of Edom and the machinations of Edom and the things they're doing behind the scenes and the propaganda that they're putting out is misleading people. And I myself was misled by it in the past. Obviously, I've repented of it, and I'm doing what little I can to expose them. And if everybody did a little bit, I think the exposure would take. It would be the equivalent of setting forth that truth and starting the wildfire. So I urge you to be very careful in what you repeat and in what you believe, because I do believe we've been misled in a lot of ways. And at one point years ago, I thought I was learning some truth, and then come to find out that it's there's a lot of layers to that onion to peel away to get to the truth, and I'm not really even sure that I'm there yet. I think I've got through to some of it, but there's always more. There's always another layer of deception. As you have observed, no institution in our modern society can long survive if its structure is not from the start erected upon a foundation of truth. The Christian faith was first erected upon a very solid foundation of truth by its founder, which of course is Yeshua. The founder of the faith is not Paul, as some have postulated. Paul's the first apostate, the deceiver. To survive, it must remain so. The deterioration, the disintegration, and finally the destruction of the structure of the Christian faith today will be accelerated in direct ratio to the extent that the misrepresentation and distortion of truth becomes a substitute of truth. Truth is an absolute quality. Truth can never be relative. There can be no degrees to truth. Truth either exists or it does not exist. To be half true is as incredible as to be half honest or to be half loyal. And if you're half loyal, you're not loyal. If you're half honest, you're not honest. That's one of the ideas that I've been trying to get across in some of my more recent videos. Yeshua said a lot of things about loyalty, about sticking with him and not believing some other one that comes with a different message. And again, I think Mr. Freedman captures that understanding very eloquently in this paragraph. I said it in a previous video. I said, there's no such thing as information being bad or being racist or being anti-Semitic or any other label that we put on information. Information is either true or false. And we need to start viewing it that way. If it's false, the closest information can get to being bad is to be false. And so if something said is false, then show the speaker where it is false. Show the listener where it is false. But to just disregard something because it hurts someone's feelings, even if it's true, I mean, that's, well, it's like I've said before. Like, if you use a lot of these terms like anti-this or anti-that, it's really just you're revealing your own intellectual weaknesses. Because someone who is truly an intellectual, powerhouse or whatever, like, you would be able to defend something as being true or false. But if you have to just throw a label on it, being anti-this or anti-that, well, that's just laziness. It's lazy and it's incompetent. If information is false, how is it false? If it's true, then it can't be bad. It can maybe be hurtful for it to be true, but that doesn't mean necessarily that it's bad. He goes on to say, you've also, as you have undoubtedly also learned, my dear Goldstein, in their attempt to do an ounce of good in one direction, many well-intentioned persons do a ton of harm in another direction. We all learn that the lesson sooner or later in life. Today finds you dedicating your unceasing efforts and your untiring energy to the task of bringing so-called or self-styled Jews to the Roman Catholic Church as converts. It must recall to you many times the day, so many years ago, when you embraced Catholicism yourself as a convert. More power to you, and the best of luck. May your efforts be rewarded with great success. Without you becoming aware of the fact, the methods you employ contribute in no small degree to dilution of the devotion of countless Christians to their Christian faith. For each ounce of so-called good you accomplish by conversion of so-called or self-styled Jews to the Christian faith, at the same time you do a ton of harm in another direction by diluting the devotion of countless Christians for their Christian faith. This bold conclusion on my part is asserted by me with the firm and fair conviction that the facts will supply my contention. In addition, it is well known fact that many counterfeit recent conversions reveal the conversions have been proved to be but infiltrations by latent traitors with treasonable intentions. And I'll pause here again to say, at some point several years ago, I ran across a sermon by a Catholic priest, and I don't remember where I heard it from. I've looked for it several times, but this priest, in his homily at his local church, revealed the infiltration of the church by communists. And of course, by communists, he would mean Edomites. And he laid out the evidence that it had been going on for years. And I think that's what Mr. Freedman is alluding to here in his letter. He's saying that there's been a lot of counterfeit conversions. And notice that the counterfeit conversions are coming from the same group of people that Mr. Goldstein is working to convert. So that should tell you who it is behind the destruction of the Catholic Church. And we got to the point now that we have two popes. One is a Jesuit pope, and one is I would say the more legitimate pope. I'm not a Catholic, but just as a third person, or third party observing what's going on, it's pretty easy to see that there's been a coup. And so just, if you want to do a little digging, a little bit of investigative homework, look into who the first Jesuits were. Who was it that founded the Jesuits? I can tell you they were converts to Catholicism. And just look at what religion they were a part of before converting to Catholicism and founding the Jesuits. It is useless to try to deny the fact that today finds the Christian faith on the defensive throughout the world. This realization staggers the imagination of the few Christians who understand the situation. The history of the world for the past several centuries and current events at home and abroad confirm the existence of such a conspiracy. The worldwide network of diabolical conspirators implement this plot against the Christian faith, while Christians appear to be sound asleep. The Christian clergy appears to be the more ignorant or more indifferent about this conspiracy other than Christians. They seem to bury their heads in the sands of ignorance or indifference like the legendary ostrich. This ignorance or indifference on the part of the Christian clergy has dealt a blow to the Christian faith, already from which it may never completely recover, if at all. He goes on to say that the Christians deserve to be blessed in this crisis with the spiritual Paul Revere to ride across the nation, warning Christians that their enemies are moving in on them. So he asked Mr. Goldstein, he says, will you volunteer to be that Paul Revere? And again, I'm passing that along to you, the viewer. Do you volunteer to be that Paul Revere? To just point out to people in your daily life that there is a group. There's a group of people who are descended from Edom, who are working tirelessly to undermine Christianity, to undermine Western civilization, and to take the world into a tyranny from which it will never recover. And most people are afraid to even talk about them. With all the respect rightly due the Christian clergy, and in all humility, I have an unpleasant duty to perform. I wish to go on record with you here that the Christian clergy are primarily, if not solely, responsible for the internal forces within the Christian faith inimical to its best interest. This conclusion, on my part, indicates the sum total of all the facts in my book, which add up to just that. If you truly desire to be realistic and constructive, you must hew the line and let the chips fall where they may. This is the only strategy that can save the Christian faith from a fate it does not deserve. You cannot pussyfoot with the truth any longer simply because you find that now the truth hurts someone you know or like. So again, this is, for fear of Edom, people are afraid to speak certain truths. And, this book is written years ago, at least 50 or 60 years ago, and I think that this letter still rings true. We can't, beat around the bush when it comes to the truth. You can't worry about whose feelings the truth is going to hurt. Because, again, the truth is not good or bad. The truth is either true or false. At this late hour, very little time is left in which to mend our fences, if I can call it that. We are not in a position to waste any more of our limited time. Beating around the bush now will get us exactly nowhere. The courageous alone will endure the present crisis when all the chips are down. Figuratively and possibly literally, there will be live heroes and dead cowards when the dust of the secular combat settles, and not dead heroes and live cowards as sometimes occurs under other circumstances. The Christian faith today remains the only anchor to windward against the universal barbarism. The dedicated enemies of the Christian faith, which of course would be Esau, have sufficiently convinced the world by this time of the savage methods they will adopt in their program to erase the Christian faith from the face of the earth. And so this conspiracy with these dedicated enemies, it began all the way back in Genesis 27:41, where Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand, then I will kill my brother Jacob. So this anti-Christianity is really just biblical Israel hatred. Mr. Freedman goes on to give an indictment against the clergy of the church for standing by and doing nothing to stop the onslaught of the enemies of Christ. And so I'm going to skip over all of that. His whole letter is only about 25 pages long. It's long, but it's not like real long. You could read it in less than an hour. I do recommend going online and finding a copy of it. Again, the name of it is Facts for Facts. But I'm going to skip to the part to really the issue that Mr. Freedman is wanting to bring to the attention of Mr. Goldstein. And he says, in my opinion, the most important reason is directly related to your present activities. Your responsibility for this confusion is not lessened by your good intentions. The utterance by the Christian clergy which confuses Christians the most is a constantly repeated utterance that Jesus was a Jew. That also appears to be your favorite theme. That misrepresentation and distortion of an incontestable historic fact is uttered by the Christian clergy upon the slightest pretext. They utter it constantly, also without provocation. They appear to be trigger-happy to utter it. They never miss an opportunity to do so. Informed and intelligent Christians cannot reconcile this truly unwarranted misrepresentation and distortion of an incontested historic fact by the Christian clergy with the information known by them now to the contrary, which comes to them from sources believed by them to be equally reliable. So what Mr. Freedman is saying, he's saying it is uncontestable that Jesus was not a Jew, and that the clergy has sources of information which tell them that he wasn't. Now, when I read this, my ears pricked up a little bit because I was like, oh, no, there's incontestable evidence that he was a Jew. It says so plainly in the Bible in multiple places. And so I was like, how in the world is he going to sit here and say that Jesus was not a Jew when the Bible says it over and over again? So now I ask you, the viewer, to stick with me for a minute. Because what he says in this letter, and I went and checked it, as best I could with the resources that I have, and I believe that he is absolutely correct. My dear Mr. Goldstein, you are a theologian of high rank and a historian of note. Of necessity, you also should agree with other outstanding authorities on the subject of whether Jesus was a Jew. These leading authorities agree today that there is no foundation in fact for the implications, inferences, and innuendos resulting from the incorrect belief that Jesus was a Jew. Incontestable historic facts and an abundance of other proofs establish beyond the possibility of any doubt the incredibility of the assertion so often heard today that Jesus was a Jew. Again, like reading these paragraphs, I was thinking, okay, now I'm interested to hear what his incontestable proof is. So he goes on to say, without any fear of contradiction based upon fact, the most competent and best qualified authorities all agree today that Jesus Christ was not a so-called or self-styled Jew. They now confirm that during his lifetime, Jesus was known as a Judean by his contemporaries and not as a Jew, and that Jesus referred to himself as a Judean and not as a Jew. During his lifetime here on earth, Jesus was referred to by contemporary historians as a Judean and not as a Jew. Contemporary theologians of Yeshua, of Jesus, whose competence to pass upon this subject cannot be challenged by anyone today, also referred to Jesus during his lifetime here on earth as a Judean and not as a Jew. So now you see where Mr. Freedman is going. It's a mistranslation of the word that we have translated in our Bibles as Jew. Inscribed upon the cross when Yeshua was crucified were the Latin words Jesus Nazareus Rex Judiorum. Pontius Pilate was the author of that infamous inscription. Latin was Pontius Pilate's mother tongue. No one will question the fact that Pontius Pilate was well able to accurately express his own ideas in his own mother tongue. The authorities competent to pass upon the correct translation into English of the Latin Jesus Nazareus Rex Judaeorum agree that it is Jesus the Nazarene, ruler of the Judeans. There is no disagreement upon that by them. During his lifetime here on earth, Yeshua was not regarded by Pontius Pilate nor by the Judeans among whom he dwelt as King of the Jews. The inscription on the cross upon which Yeshua was crucified has been incorrectly translated into English language only since the 18th century. Pontius Pilate was ironic and sarcastic when he ordered inscribed upon the cross the Latin words, Jesus Nazareus Rex Judaeorum. About to be crucified with the approval of Pontius Pilate, Yeshua was being mocked by Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was well aware at the time that Yeshua had been denounced, denied by the Judeans, who, alas, finally brought about his crucifixion as related by history. Except for his few followers at the time in Judea, all other Judeans, or as I added, Edomites, abhorred Yeshua and detested his teachings and the thing for which he stood. The deplorable fact cannot be erased from history by time. Pontius Pilate was himself the ruler of the Judeans at the time he ordered inscribed upon the cross in the Latin words, Jesus Nazareus Rex Judaeorum. In English, Jesus the Nazarene, ruler of the Judeans, but Pontius Pilate never referred to himself as ruler of the Judeans. The ironic and sarcastic reference of Pontius Pilate to Yeshua as ruler of the Judeans can hardly be accepted as recognition by Pontius Pilate of Yeshua as ruler of the Judeans. That is inconceivable by any interpretation. So, in other words, if Pontius Pilate was seriously naming Yeshua as the ruler of the Judeans, when in fact it was Rome who was ruling the Judeans, that would be an act of treason. It is obvious that he was being sarcastic and mocking. It was, he wasn't legitimately pronouncing Yeshua to be King of the Jews. At the time of the crucifixion of Yeshua, Pontius Pilate was the administrator in Judea for the Roman Empire. At that time in history, the area of the Roman Empire included a part of the Middle East. As far as he was concerned, officially or personally, the inhabitants of Judea were Judeans. To Pontius Pilate, and so-called Jew, as they have been styled since the 18th century. In the name of Pontius Pilate in history, there is no religious, racial, or national group in Judea known as Jew, nor had there been any group so identified anywhere else in the world prior to that time. So, in the days of Pontius Pilate, in the days of Yeshua, there was not a religious group, racial group, national group in Judea known as Jews. So, any time that the term Jew appears, it is really the Greek or Latin word for Judeans, not Jews. Pontius Pilate expressed little interest as the administrator of the Roman Empire officially or personally in the wide variety of forms of religious worship then practiced in Judea. These forms of religious worship extended from phallic worship and other forms of idolatry to the emerging spiritual philosophy of an eternal, omnipotent, and invisible divine deity, the emerging Yahweh concept, which predated Abraham of the Bible, of biblical fame, approximately 2,000 years. As the administrator for the Roman Empire in Judea, it was the official policy of Pontius Pilate never to interfere in the spiritual affairs of the local population. And that's true. Rome had given the Judeans a license to practice their religion. So it would have been the religion of the Judeans, which is why the official, it's actually the reason why the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts was written, was because the Jews, the Pharisees there, they were making the claim to Rome that this religion being taught by Paul was not the same as the religion they had been given a license for. And so Rome stayed out of the issue of the religion of the people of Judea. The only time they got involved was because of that claim that was made about what Paul was teaching. Pontius Pilate's primal responsibility was the collection of taxes to be forwarded home to Rome, not the forms of religious worship practiced by the Judeans from whom these taxes were collected. In Latin, in the lifetime of Yeshua, the name of the political subdivision in the Middle East known in modern history as Palestine was Judea. It was then administered by Pontius Pilate as administrator for the Roman Empire, of which it was a part. The English for the Latin Judea is Judea. In English, Judean is the adjective for the noun Judea. The ancient native population of the subdivision in the Middle East, known in modern history as Palestine, was then called Judaeus in Latin and Judean in English. Those words identified the indigenous population of Judea in the lifetime of Yeshua. Who can deny that Yeshua was a member of the indigenous population of Judea in his lifetime? And of course you know, my dear Mr. Goldstein, in Latin, the genitive plural of Judaeus is Judaeorum. The English translation of the genitive plural of Judaeorum is of the Judeans. It is utterly impossible to give any other English translation to Judaeorum than of the Judeans. Qualified and competent theologians and historians regard as incredible any other translation into English of Jesus Nazareus Rex Judaeorum than Yeshua the Nazarene, ruler of the Judeans. You must agree this is literally correct. At the time Pontius Pilate was ordering the Jesus Nazareum Rex Judeans inscribed upon the cross, the spiritual leaders of Judea were protesting the Pontius Pilate not to write that Jesus was the ruler of the Judeans, but to inscribe instead that Yeshua had said that he was the ruler of the Judeans. The spiritual leaders of Judea made very strong protest to Pontius Pilate against his reference to Yeshua as Rex Judaeorum, insisting that Pontius Pilate was not familiar with or misunderstood the status of Yeshua in Judea. These protests are a matter of historical record, as you know. The spiritual leaders in Judea protested in vain with Pontius Pilate. They insisted that Yeshua had said that he was the ruler of the Judeans, but Pontius Pilate was not to write that Yeshua was the ruler of the Judeans, for after all, Pontius Pilate was a foreigner in Judea who could not understand the local situations as well as the spiritual leaders. The intricate pattern of the domestic, political, social, and economic cross-currents in Judea interested Pontius Pilate very little as Rome's administrator. And Pontius Pilate washed his hands of the protest by the spiritual leaders in Judea who demanded of him that the inscription on the cross authored by Pontius Pilate be corrected in the manner they insisted upon. Pontius Pilate very impatiently replied to their demands, "What I have written, I have written." The inscription on the cross remained what it had been, Jesus Nazareus Rex Judaeorum, or Jesus the Nazarene, ruler of the Judeans in English. So what Mr. Freedman is repeatedly making the point about is that the word there for that is translated today as Jews did not say Jews, it said Judeans. It was an adjective to describe people who lived in Judea. Judean is the same way that you would say, the people that occupy England, you would call them English. It's an adjective to describe occupiers of England. There is no factual foundation in history or theology today for the implications, inferences, and innuendos that the Greek Judaeos, the Latin Judaeus, or the English Judean ever possessed a valid religious connotation. In their three respective languages, these three words have only indicated a strictly topographical or geographical connection in their correct sense. These three words in their respective languages were used to identify the members of the indigenous native population of the geographic area known as Judea in the lifetime of Jesus. During the lifetime of Jesus, there was not a form of religious worship practiced in Judea or elsewhere in the known world which bore a name even remotely resembling the name of the political subdivision of the Roman Empire, i.e., Judaism from Judea. No cult or sect existed by such a name. In fact, I'll go even say that Judaism did not even exist in its present form until after 500 A.D., and that's when the Babylonian Talmud was completed. So even the Pharisaical religion of Judea is not the same as modern Judaism. Now, it eventually morphed and evolved into modern Judaism, and it's finally codified with the Babylonian Talmud. But there was no Judaism as a religion that was taught at the time. It is an incontestable fact that the word Jew did not come into existence until the year 1775. Prior to 1775, the word Jew did not exist in any language. The word Jew was introduced into the English for the first time in the 18th century when Sheridan used in his play The Rivals. It said, "She shall have a skin like a mummy and the beard of a Jew." Prior to this use of the word Jew in the English language by Sheridan in 1775, the word Jew had not become a word in the English language. Shakespeare never saw the word Jew, as you will see. Shakespeare never used the word Jew in any of his works. The common general belief to the contrary notwithstanding, in his Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare wrote as follows, "What is the reason? I am a you, have not I you eyes?" In the Latin Saint Germain 4th century Vulgate edition of the New Testament, Yeshua is referred to by the genitive plural of Judaeus. In the Gospel of John, reference to the inscription on the cross, Judaeorum, was in the 4th century that St. Jerome translated into Latin the manuscripts of the New Testament from the original languages in which they were written. This translation by St. Jerome is referred to still today as the Vulgate edition by the Roman Catholic Church authorities who use it today. Yeshua is referred to as a so-called Jew for the first time in the New Testament in the 18th century. Jesus is first referred to as a so-called Jew in the revised 18th century editions in the English language of the 14th century first translations of the New Testament into English. The history of the origin of the word Jew in the English language leaves no doubt that the 18th century Jew is the 18th century contracted and corrupted English word for the 4th century Latin Judaeus, or Judaeus, found in St. Jerome's Vulgate edition. Of that, there is no longer doubt. As you know, my dear Dr. Goldstein, the best-known 18th century editions of the New Testament in English are the Reims-Douay edition and the King James Authorized edition. The Reims-Douay translation of the New Testament into English was first printed in 1582, but the word Jew did not appear in it. The King James Authorized translation of the New Testament into English began in 1604 and first published in 1611. The word Jew did not appear in it either. The word Jew appeared in both of these well-known editions in their 18th century revised versions for the first times. Countless copies of the revised 18th century editions of the Reims-Douay and the King James translation of the New Testament into English were distributed to the clergy and to the laity throughout the English-speaking world. They did not know the history of the origin of the English word Jew, nor did they care. They accepted the English word Jew as the only and as the accepted form of the Latin Judaicus and the Greek Judaeos. How could they be expected to have known otherwise? The answer is that they could not, and they did not. It was a new English word to them. My dear Dr. Goldstein, if the generally accepted understanding today of the English Jew and Judean conveyed the identical implications, inferences, and innuendos as both rightly should and would make no difference which of these two words was used when referring to Yeshua in the New Testament or elsewhere. So that That part that's highlighted in yellow, that's important to understand. That's really the point of everything that he said up until now. If these two words meant the same thing, there would be no issue, but they don't. The implications, inferences, and innuendos today conveyed by these two words are as different as black is from white. The word Jew today is never regarded as a synonym for Judean, nor is Judean regarded as a synonym for Jew. As I have explained, when the word Jew was first introduced into the English language in the 18th century, it was one and only implication, inference, and innuendo was Judean. However, during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, a well-organized and well-financed international pressure group created a so-called secondary meaning for the word Jew. So I wonder who that well-financed international group is. Among the English-speaking peoples of the world, this so-called secondary meaning of the word Jew bears no relation whatsoever to the 18th century original connotation of the word Jew. It is a misrepresentation. So in other words, they have taken a word that had a established meaning and they changed the meaning because they knew that if they changed the meaning of the word at some point in the future, people would come to understand that word to have originally meant what the new definition is. This is no different than the way that they try to redefine words today. There are certain trigger words that they are changing the definition of, and they're doing it to, skew the argument to where you can't make heads or tails of what is being argued. And so I used the example in previous videos of the words racism and anti-Semitism, and they've changed the meanings of these words. They have purposefully and intentionally altered the meaning of it to where now you're having an argument with someone and they call you one of those words, and you're saying, like in the case of Kanye, where he was like, here's the definition of this anti-Semitic word. I'm not doing this. All I'm saying is that this person is a Jew. It's no different than me saying my lawyer's a Jew. And he's being ridiculed because he doesn't understand that the definition of anti-Semitism has changed. Well, they also did it to the word Jew. The definition of the word Jew changed. So now, when we read the Bible, and it says that Yeshua was a Jew, what we should understand that word to mean is Judean, because that's the original meaning of the word. But they've changed the definition to now mean an adherent to the religion of Judaism, which he was not. The secondary meanings of words often become the generally accepted meanings of words formerly having entirely different meanings. This is accomplished by the expenditure of a great amounts of money for well-planned publicity. Or, in the example he's about to cite, advertising. So today, if you ask for a camel, someone will hand you a cigarette by that name. If you ask for a piece of ivory, someone will hand you a piece of soap. You will never receive a desert animal or a piece of the tusk of a male elephant. That must illustrate the extent to which these secondary meanings are able to practically eclipse the original and correct meanings of words in the minds of the general public. The secondary meaning of the word Jew today has practically totally eclipsed the original and correct meaning of the word Jew when it was introduced as a word in the English language. This phenomenon is not uncommon. To allege that Jesus was Jew in the sense that during his lifetime Jesus professed and practiced the form of religious worship known and professed under the modern name of Judaism is false and fiction of the most blasphemous nature. If to be a so-called or self-styled Jew, then or now the practice of Judaism was the requirement, then Jesus certainly was not a so-called Jew. Jesus abhorred and denounced the form of religious worship practiced in Judea in his lifetime, and which is known and practiced today under its new name, Judaism. That religious belief was then known as Pharisaism. The Christian clergy learned that in their theological seminary days, but they have never made any attempt to make that clear to Christians. So this is one of those things that they're taught in seminary, but they don't teach you about it. It's withheld from the general public. Now, I mean, you can dig into the research that this gentleman here, Mr. Freedman, has done, but most people don't do that. Most people don't even really know where to begin to do that. The celebrated Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, in his world-famous classic, The Pharisees, the sociological background of their faith, traces the origin of the form of religious worship practiced today under the present name Judaism to its origin as Pharisaism in Judea at the time of Jesus. Rabbi Louis Finkelstein confirms what the eminent Rabbi Adolf Moses states in his great classic, Yahwism and Other Discourses, in collaboration with the celebrated Rabbi H.G. Enlow, published in 1903 by the Louisville section of the Council of Jewish Women, in which Rabbi Adolf Moses on page 1 states, "Among the innumerable misfortunes which have befallen, the most fatal in its consequence is the name Judaism. Worse still, the Jews themselves, who have gradually come to call their religion Judaism. Yet neither in biblical nor post-biblical, neither in Talmudic nor in much later times is the term Judaism ever heard. The Bible speaks of the religion as Torah or Toroth Yahweh, the instruction or the moral law revealed by Yahweh, in other places as Yeroth Yahweh, the fear and reverence of Yahweh. These and other appellations continue for many ages to stand for the religion, to distinguish it from Christianity and Islam. The Jewish philosophers sometimes designate it as the faith or belief of the Jews. It was Flavius Josephus, writing for the instruction of Greeks and Romans, who coined the term Judaism in order to pit it against Hellenism. But Hellenism was understood the civilization comprising language, poetry, religion, art, science, manners, customs, institutions, which has spread from Greece, its original home, of the vast regions of Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Christians eagerly seized upon the name. The Jews themselves, who intensely detested the traitor Josephus, refrained from reading his works. Hence, the term Judaism, coined by Josephus, remained absolutely unknown to them. It was only in comparatively recent times, after the Jews became familiar with modern Christian literature, that they began to call their religion Judaism. So, the term Judaism does not come from the Jews themselves. It comes from the Christians. The Christians started calling their religion Judaism, and then eventually the Jews kind of adopted it. The same thing with the name Jew. They got the term Jew from Christians. It's not something that originated within their religious sect. It's something they were called by outsiders, and then they adopted it themselves. So at this point, I went and decided to dig in as best I could, and looking at various translations and various information in the online resources that we have for biblical translation. So I looked in BibleHub.com, and I went to John 19:19, where it mentions the inscription that Pilate puts above the cross. And if you'll notice, as you go through all these different translations, they all say King of the Jews, King of the Jews, until you get to the Aramaic version, which is translated correctly from Aramaic as the King of the Judeans. So, if Aramaic was the language they were speaking in Judea, you would expect that to be the most accurate rendition of what was intended by the author, the original author of the scripture, which in this case would have been John. But that's the only translation that gets it right, as King of the Judeans. So I went into the interlinear, and there's the word 2453, Judean, which to me, that says Judean, clearly just looking at it written there, but it's translated as Jews, not Judean. I went into the concordance, and it said Jewish, a Jew, Judea. Now notice that Jewish is an adjective. Notice the part of speech is an adjective. So the term Jew did not exist in the first century. But it was an adjective that was related to Judea. And as you see there below where it says definition, Jewish, a Jew, Judea, and in fact 46 times this word is used to mean Judea as it's translated in the scripture. And then I looked at Strong's concordance, and Strong says it means Judean or of Judea, which completely reinforces what Mr. Freedman is saying. And so here is Revelation 2:9, speaking about the synagogue of Satan, who claim they are Judeans and are liars. So again, 2453 is the Strong's number. And again, 2453 is the Strong's number. So every time you see the word Jews, and you can look this up for yourself in the concordance, it is this word, Judaeus or Judean. And according to the concordance information that we have from Strong's, it means Judean. It is an adjective. The word Jew is a noun. So if it's an adjective, it is being used to describe a person. So it is Judean. Judean is an adjective because it's an adjective used as a noun. So from what I can tell, Mr. Freeman is totally correct when he says the English translation of the genitive plural of Judaeorum is of the Judeans. It is utterly impossible to give any other English translation to Judaeorum other than of the Judeans. So for the times that I've said that Jesus is a Jew, I stand corrected. I was wrong. And now you know the truth too. That Yeshua he never considered him part of that religious group. And so if you want to say Yeshua was a Judean, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely correct. That's biblically correct. That is true. But to say he's a Jew with the understanding of the current meaning of the word Jew, that's incorrect. So thank you for listening. I pray that... that brings up an interesting point also, is Josephus said that there were three primary philosophies in Judea in the first century. There was the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. And of the Essenes, he said, these were Jews by birth. And now we can take that understanding where he says, and they were Judeans by birth, which means they were the ones that were actually ethnically descended from Judah. And see now all this kind of comes together and it makes sense. And it's all different pieces of the puzzle that give you the same picture. And so when the book of Revelation says that they say they are Jews and are not, then you understand that it is only referring to the ethnicity of being descended from Judah. They are claiming to be descended from Judah and are not. Which that in itself, again, goes back to this understanding that they were actually Edomites. So thank you for listening. I pray that this has been a blessing, and I bid you shalom.